off we go to the next speaker, who's a personal friend of mine. You might have seen our podcast type things on YouTube that we've been doing since the lockdown started, really. And of course, everybody knows Thomas Sheridan.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Neil, and all the crew and everybody for putting this beautiful event together. I'm delighted so many of you came to see me because it was like really difficult getting here. It was like Steve McQueen in The Great Escape. I literally had to sneak over the border. I escaped actually, but I had to get over the border. So technically I'm a fugitive. Neil, you'll be paying my bail when I get back. But it's great to be here to escape the COVID banana republic that I live in, well, potato republic that I live in. And I'm delighted there's somebody here. And I want to talk about something that kind of goes through all my work. And I'm a great believer in mythology as being something that's much more powerful than just stories. I'm an ardent fan of the American mythologist Joseph Campbell, and also the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist, the father of clinical psychiatry, Carl Jung. And there's a belief that human beings today are not different than human beings were in the past. We have the same beliefs, desires, inclinations, and everything else. And often megaliths are, while absolutely they should be, and definitely a spiritual experience, they're also a very humanistic experience. So I've also been fascinated by fairy tales. And ever since I read a book by Bruno Bettelheim called The Uses of Enchantment. And basically he showed that European fairy tales were absolutely the true story of the European social experience. And they were often very, very, very darker than what we were given when we were presented by either Disney or TV or adaptations and so on, even Brothers Grimm ones, which tend to be quite dark. But the belief was that they told us real stories about real human experiences in a very visceral way. Now, I started to think, well, do the megaliths have this as well? Do the megaliths have stories? Well, of course they do. You know Stanton Drew down by Bristol, and there's supposed to be a wedding party, and I've always found that story that they were turned to stone. Well, that's also quite close to a very old church, so maybe there was a kind of a biblical overlay of being turned to stone, where the types if you went back to paganism and so on. So this is fascinating stuff. This stuff has always fascinated me. So, like, what does folklore, mythology, and stories tell us about the past, the megalithic, and other locations? Because remember, history has never ended. Our stories are always continually ongoing. Now, how old are these stories? They're incredibly ancient. Surprisingly so. There was a university project that took place between universities in Portugal and here in England, where they used genetic analytical software, which they could find certain codes to trace back family lineages or racial lineages, and they applied it to certain motifs and themes within certain fairy tales. And so they discovered, going back through the Indo-European folklore of the fairy tale story, they found out that these stories go right back to at least the Bronze Age by using these following sequences back. And certain stories in particular, fascinating, Jack and the Beanstalk, and that was a common one. We'll talk about that later in Giants, and the relationship between the human experience and that of the giant. Also, anything to do with a smith, any story to do with a magical smith, like that, where something went wrong. Incredibly ancient, these stories they found, where, for instance, like the story of Thor and how his hammer Mjolnir was made, the handle was made shorter because the dwarven forge smith was bitten by a horsefly. This is a tremendously ancient story and type of story, and there's something happening with metallurgy, a smith, and something goes wrong. And that was very deeply embedded in our ancient past, showing just how powerful, when we move towards metallurgy in the Iron Age, how that affected human consciousness. So this is what fascinates me, is like why, where, when, how, and why did it generate these archetypes and generate these stories. But Jack and the Beanstalk, and the concept of a giant being deceived by a sneaky... If you read that book in its clarity, Jack is actually a psychopath because he moves into people's houses and decides how to destroy them. So that was how I came across this stuff, and my early work in through Bruno Bettelheim. Now, these are called rats, or Ferry Forts in Ireland, very commonly called Ferry Forts. These circular enclosures, there are 40 to 50,000 of them in Ireland. At least, there may be more even that have been destroyed over the centuries. But there's at least 40 to 50,000 of them. This one is in Cruachan Rathcrogan in County Roscommon. It's where there was the ancient capital. On the east you had Tara, on the west you had Cruachan Rathcrogan, where Queen Maeve and her kingdom basically operated. This is a very remarkable place. It's full of ancient sites, including a very famous cave called Owen Nagat, which is, for today, Halloween, where the Morrigan emerges from on Samhain. So, Shona Samhain, by the way, everybody. So this couldn't have happened on a more auspicious day. But she emerges on Samhain. And the Christians called it the Hellmouth of Ireland. But it's a very deep part of Ireland. It's not spectacular like Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. But I think because it hasn't been taken over by UNICEF or something, it has that ancient feel that you get in certain places. But these circular enclosures have a phenomenal antiquity. They're talked about like they were built from probably the Neolithic all the way up to the early Middle Ages. Now, the pagan Irish loved circles. They absolutely built nothing in a square, and it wasn't until the Roman Empire invaded Ireland through Catholicism that square buildings and square enclosures start happening in Ireland. But you can always tell the pagan place. You can always tell the church that was built on a pagan site in Ireland because it's surrounded by what they call a cashel, which is a circular or oval shaped enclosure. That's the mark of the Druid, that's the mark of the pagan. And these things, where we were told in school, were for holding cattle or defensive structures. Well, they're absolutely useless as defensive structures. I mean, you can stones over them and kill the people inside. And for cattle as well, easy enough to break them down and get into them. They may have been used as some kind of corralling for the winter to feed them and take care of the cows, but I don't think they were specifically designed for any great, defensive military purpose. But when I was a kid, I grew up in north Dublin, north side of Dublin. I used to take a bus out into the countryside, and there was loads of them, and I'd go walk for hours and hours. And so I've been looking at these things all my life. Now, they're full of folklore. In Ireland, there's one not just in front of my house. If you walk into these on Samhain night, the story is that the fairies will kidnap you and take you into the underworld, and you might not come out. And fairy abductions are very similar to alien abduction stories. They're identical, in fact. It's remarkable how similar they are. Missing time, examinations, same kind of entities appear inside the experience, and so on. But the fairy abduction story, you don't go on Samhain night inside one of these. And to this day, parents and warn their kids, do not play football inside them. The fairies are in there, they will annoy them. Now, one thing I discovered was, you can see the road at the bottom here? These hedgerows here, they were all mostly planted starting in the Middle Ages, starting the Norman Conquest. And that's why you have the patchwork quilt fields of Ireland. I discovered years ago, and I've confirmed it numerous times ever since, that if there was wild strawberries growing along here, when they reached the tip of the fairy ring, the wild strawberries were bigger, more abundant, and more delicious. So that made me think then that these had some kind of agricultural purpose. Now, I spoke of megalithomania about 3 years ago, about the round towers of Ireland, and they would definitely been shown by local farmers that if your cattle graze at the bottom of them, they produce better milk and they're less prone to disease. a genius American engineer called Callahan discovered all this in the 50s. And you talk to an Irish farmer, and they'll tell you, they graze around the bottom of around healthier, and the grass grows better and it's more nutritious. Well, funny enough, you don't send your animals inside these, because they'll tell you the exact opposite, that the fairies damaged them. And the cattle will sometimes actually be mutilated. Now, that's also a thing in the UFO phenomenon as well, the cattle mutilations as well. You see, so now talking about what this is, archetypes, mythology, folklore, changes over the centuries. Today's fairy, I think it was Aleister Crowley who said, in the past we called them demons, in the future we will call them something else. And that's why Awas looks like a great alien. And the same thing is identical to the alien abduction experience, to be taken away with the fairies. William Butler Yeats has a play called The Land of the Heart's Desire. And I actually did a performance of it in one of these times, playing a Catholic priest, me. And the play was incredibly powerful. It's about a girl on her wedding night, and a fairy comes in and entices her into a lesbian relationship and says, if you come live with me in the fairyland, you will be beautiful forever, you'll be wild and free forever. And the play is all about the schism between Christianity and paganism. It's like the priest is adamant, if you go there, you'll get everlasting life, but you will... So considering now, these go back to the Neolithic, we're told, many in the Bronze Age, we already know a massive story that has been brought up to the present in terms of fairy folklore. And it introduces things to like the modern fairy folklore of alien abduction. I'm not saying this experience is not true. I actually do believe they're real. But they're far more complex than someone coming from space in a spaceship. It's tied in ancient, deep recesses and parts of our subconscious and lower poles of cognition. It's extremely deep stuff. Now, this is Évora in Portugal, and this is again a spectacular site of many, many large stones. Now, in Portugal, these megaliths are, particularly around Évora, are connected to a group called the Moras Enchantadas. Basically, a witchcraft, kind of like a female Freemasonry of witches. Now this is ancient, and to show the power that witches has within Portuguese folklore, not only are they connected with the building of the megaliths, they're also connected with present day healing, ritualistic stuff with the megaliths. So we're talking again 5,000 years of a continual thing. And to show the power and depth of these archetypes, the Moras Enchantadas during the Islamic Caliphate of Iberia, when the Moors ran Portugal and Spain, what is Portugal now, and Spain for 700 years, 900 years, the Moors Enchantadas were taken over by the Islamic culture, and they maintained as Muslim healers with witches. And you have the stories of menhirs that were the Moors Enchantadas at this time were Muslim. So again, that must have been some powerful sect. The Islamic Caliphate brought it into its own fold. So there you have a living repository. Folklore thing goes right back to megalithic times, Neolithic times, and continues to the present. Now these cup and ring circle things, these are very common in Ireland, not too many in England, but actually I think I'm discovering more and more that I wasn't aware of, so that was my own ignorance. But in Scandinavian folklore, these are seen as kind of telephone and telegraphic portals to the fairy world. And seeds, particularly in places like Karelia, in northern, where Russia meets Finland and Norway, there's a large number of stones there with these cup and ring marks in. And there's a belief that in Finland it's devils on the other side. In Sweden, Norway and Russia it's fairies on the other side, elves I might call them. And you place seeds into the cup parks, and then this is taken by the fairy or the elf or the devil into the other world as an offering, that they do not mess up with your crops and stuff like that. This is still practiced to this day in that part of the world. again, a tremendous continuum. So this whole thing of like, what were the megaliths for? What did they do? There's tremendous mysteries regarding alignments with the sun and all this stuff. And that's why did they do them? But the obvious thing that many people didn't look at is the contemporary folklore of today that surrounds them actually connected or germane to what they were in the past. I've discovered that they probably are. So we're probably actually getting to religious lives and spiritual lives were. So really, it's really, this one here I'm showing a picture. This is called the Bahia Stone, and it's in County Mayo. And you saw the sun going down. Well, that happens if you stand on the stone. The sun climbs up Croagh Mountain, a very sacred mountain in Ireland, on the day of the planting season, and on the day of the harvest season goes down the other side. So that's what Peter and Sue are doing is phenomenal work in understanding the sanctity of the landscape. I call it the environomicon, but the landscape is integral to the megaliths. It's not something that sets apart from them. And so that's why things like simulacrum and how the sun reacts to existing landscapes and so on. The ancient ancestors, the poetry, the stories, to actual practical applications in the case of the Bahia Stone and the sun. And what do they put in the holes? Seeds. So there you go. You can do a kind of a detective story using the mysteries that were mysteries, and suddenly, well, hold on a second. There's a deep here. Now this is a remarkable place in Sri Lanka. It's near Andhra, which is the Muslim center of Sri Lanka. And it was a royal garden, and in it there's this unbelievable carving it looks like it's an electronics diagram. It's thousands of years old. They don't even know how old it is. And they actually call it a stargate. And they actually believe that if you meditate upon this, you will travel through this thing into other realities and dimensions. It's literally a machine. And it's on a rock that's at an angle. And it's in a place that's associated with modern day deep spirituality within Sri Lanka. So here we have another connection. We always talk about, well, look how many churches are built upon ancient Neolithic or Bronze Age sites, right? Well, the same thing has happened in parts of Asia with the Buddhists. The Buddhists were also canny as well and moved in and said, if this was an existent pagan site, I don't know if you know Sigiriya, it's an enormous mountain. At the bottom of that are caves full of writing. They don't know how old it is. It's so ancient and no one can read it anymore. And that's also near here too as well. So the Buddhists knew there was a tremendous significance, moved in, took it over, and what happens? Same thing that happens here. Told the locals that these were all built by devil worshippers, that the people before us worshipped devils and demons. And that's what that all means. But this thing is considered a literal stargate. It's a couple of meters across. I have another picture of my hand is in front of it. But I put my hand right where that concentric circle is. And that's the same kind of like rock art you get in many places in Ireland. It didn't seem foreign or alien to me. And what does that tell you? That there's a universal archetypal core to everything we do as human beings in terms of our spiritual and mythological expressions. And while I was there, this Hindu gentleman came along and he meditated in front of it. And he told me that all his past lives came to him. He saw all his past lives in one go in front of him. And then he says, why don't you meditate in front of it? And I didn't really, because it was incredibly hot and I wasn't relaxed. But just being around this thing did it for me. And again, this thing, here was I there that day. It's an antiquarian piece of complex and rather remarkable rock art, and then a Hindu gentleman comes along and uses it to relive his past lives. So again, continuation. We are the past is us, and we often forget that. Now, this is a place called Delft. It's an island that exists between India and Sri Lanka. It's quite difficult to get to. In fact, it was the most torturous boat ride of my life. It was like 3 hours crossing the rough seas, shark-infested waters, in this boat with about 200 people on it, and Bollywood music playing at a phenomenal volume. And it was really terrifying. And we got to this island, and I went there just to see. This is why when you get interested in this stuff, you'll do the most stupid things to find, the most dangerous things to find these stones. This is the Cobra Stone, and this started growing a few decades ago out of the ground. Now, what's interesting and remarkable is that this island is just basically a coral reef that rose up. So there's no real stone on it, it's just coral. It has stone walls like you see in Ireland and the north of England, but they're all made from coral. It has, for the decades, different kind of stone than what's on the island, and they cannot explain how this thing is coming up from the earth, and it's right behind a Hindu temple dedicated to the Nagas. Who are the Nagas? The underworld snake gods of the Vedic world. And so this Cobra Stone, they call it, starts coming up out of the ground, and they covered it in flowers and garland. They travel from India and Sri Lanka and other countries to venerate this thing. And there's a picture of me there, and you can see it's about 5 feet tall now. Back in the 1920s, it was very, very short. They've been observing it growing, and they cannot explain this thing. They just can't explain this thing. But what's the most beautiful thing about this is, here we have what the ancestors did with the stones on these islands and around Europe. They're doing it in Delft today. So it hasn't died. It exists. Human beings are venerating stones. Now, and that got me thinking about, put me into kind of like wild flights of fancy. Did any of the stones that are venerated here actually happen to them? You know, stones like the Cat Stone in Ushnock in the centre of Ireland, which is almost the geographic bang-on centre of Ireland. This particularly uninteresting stone, well, it's a big rock, but it's not a megalith, and yet it's held in the same high esteem as all the other megaliths in the country. I was going, did that one day suddenly pop out of the ground, or rather than it being a glacial erratic? Can we actually affect stone through meditation and stuff like this, through contemplation? Does the stone come to us? There's an amazing phenomena in Romania, and there's these stones called trovons. Anybody ever heard of them? They are living stones. What they do is, these stones they're limestone. You cut them in half right down the middle, and they're limestone, and they're ball shaped, and they actually walk across the countryside. And when it rains, new stones come out of them, and I'm got a conspiracy theory that the reason why it's so unknown, this incredible phenomena, is because it basically tears the arse out of things like Darwinism and all the things like that, because you cannot explain a living stone using the Darwinian method. Go back tonight and see these videos, these trovons. It's one part of Romania they're in, and they're stones that are alive and move across the country. And you cut them open, there's nothing in there. There's nothing like a turtle or something moving them along. They're solid stone all the way through. A live, living stone. And then, what do our ancestors always believe about these stones? They were alive. So again, there are mysteries. This is the great, it's great to be a polymathic, like what you does with megalithomania. He brings people in from all over. Because for years we were kind of insular on these islands. It was Newgrange, Stonehenge, Avebury. We were looking too much at our own stuff. But I think when you get kind of polymathic about it and start looking at all the stuff that happens around the world, it's a great way of understanding your own stuff, And that was a classic for me. I was very moved by this experience. It was well worth going to this island, because you see those folks behind me and the lady behind me. These people had a genuine spiritual conviction for this stone. You know, they were genuinely happy to have traveled to have seen it. And I thought it was a very beautiful thing. So there we have 21st century people worshipping real stones that have real magical powers. And yes, it's also used for healing and things like that. Now, I said I'd talk about the giants thing. And I know you gave a great talk on that yesterday. And there's something very powerful to this whole giant story. I'm not an expert on it, but it's one of those things that you say, yeah, there has to be something to it. There has to be there's something real going on here. And of course, we hear the stories of, large bones and so on that have been found around the world, and these incredibly corpses that have been found, and they go missing for some reason. You give them to the Smithsonian, the local university, and boom, they're gone. And this thing. And, of all the things that people around the world could call a megalith, it's always the giants thing. Ever notice that? There's a giants ring in Belfast. Where I live, there's a court cairn that's called the Giants Tomb. They never call them anything else. They never call them the God's Tomb or the God's Grave it's always, if they throw a kind of a standard meaning, a standard excuse, it's always giant. It's always giant. So that shows you alone there's some kind of archetypal memory functioning within there. And of course, I find it fascinating that a tiny island like Malta is associated with giants. The smaller the landmass, the more likely to have the giant stories connect. Well, I know that's not true, but I just found that one always kind of ironic. Now, Maltese folklore tells a similar story to Jack and the Beanstalk. I have a book of Maltese folklore that was in Maltese, and I got someone to translate it for me. And the stories were the same. People tricking giants, and humans being very bad to giants, being very nasty to them. And the Jack and the Beanstalk story all over the Maltese folklore. Like they would do things like they would want the giant's house. And they would say something like, well, whoever can eat the most pasta will get the giant's house. And what they would do is they would put things in the ravioli to make the giant sleepy and wasn't able to win the race. Like these and the humans and we got his house and he died outside. Very, very cold actually. Now, you showed the picture yesterday of the sleeping lady that was taken at the Hypergeum Halsafalini. That thing is tiny. It's like about that size. And I made a film on the Maltese Giants, and in that I speculated that I think my theory, could be nonsense, but my theory was that gravity changed. And as gravity changed, smaller humans had an advantage over large ones because the big ones would have had compression on their organs and their lower body, making it difficult for them to basically get around. And if you look at the statues in places like Tarjim of the Maltese giants, the bottom of their legs are very strange. They're bulbous, like they're really overweight, and you have tiny ankles. Again, that would suggest the fluids in their body at the bottom. And then they call her a sleeping lady, but is she the dying giant? And that thing is carved with beautiful affection. There's an actual real affection there. And we know in Sicilian folklore, they say the giants existed in Malta before we arrived, the people from Sicily. They were already there, and they'd already built the Temple of Gigantia, that one there, in Gozo. That one's in Sardinia, on top of a mountain, by the way. I always show that to people to say, oh, they just moved them by logs. Anyone will tell you the country's covered in stones that are like bowling balls. It's impossible to walk across. And they pulled these things in the bottom of the valley floor of a mountain and put it on top of a mountain. And I always say that's it. And they always come with the usual, so it was aliens, wasn't it? The usual crap. But that's always been a great one. But they're all giants' graves, giants' tombs, this kind of thing. Now, the Maltese thing, why the small island? I thought about it. If gravity was increasing, access to the sea would be vital. because it creates buoyancy. And a person who weighs a tremendous amount, they can relieve the pressures on their body and their bones and their organs if they have easy access to the water. So the floating giants of Malta was kind of like my theory that I came up with. And it was a means, and that's what kept them alive longer than giants who died off everywhere else. They were simply, it was almost like the country was like a living spa for them, because they could actually have flotation. And that if you get onto my channel Beyond Room 313, you can watch that documentary there, and there's all other documentaries and films relating to the topics I talk about. Sardinia, also in the Mediterranean, a whole other concept regarding giants. They were kind of like, they were talking about the Nuragic people, and there was a powerful sense of bull veneration. This is actually common all over all Indo-European cultures, and it's another one that brings us to the present, is the worship of cows and bulls. Bovine veneration. And a lot of it had to do with a racial memory that about 7,000 years ago human beings developed a gene that allowed, Indo-Europeans developed a gene that allowed us to consume dairy products without becoming ill. So we developed a lactose tolerance. And this gene, and it's an interesting thing that people who are probably lactose intolerant, maybe because they go right back to the Proto-Europeans who existed before the Indo-European invasion or migration, whatever you want to call it. So if your lactose intolerance is, perhaps you were actually directly related to the people who built Stonehenge and Newgrange and all the other Neolithic monuments. But the bull, because of this consumption, ability to consume milk, this is how cows and bull veneration became gods. And this is why they were, in Ireland is the Tyne-Bo Cruige, which is a famous epic about a black bull that was fought between Ulster and Connacht, and that involves Queen Maeve and Cuchulainn. It's a tremendous epic that also tells you the story about tribe and resisting oppression, and how the warrior has to take a stance against even his own half-brother, because a soldier's job is a soldier's job, and this kind of thing. And at the end, after the bull has been saved, Cuchulainn straps himself to a standing stone with his own intestines, and then the Morrigan lands on his shoulder and takes his spirit to the other world. And that's every school child in Ireland is taught that story, and it actually sinks in so deeply as a part of our culture. And it's even why Northern Ireland is separated from the Republic, because that story takes place between the men of Ulster and the rest of Ireland. So the Northern Irish people to this day will say, well, we're different. We've always been fighting the Irish. They've always been trying to invade us. And people laugh at that, but on some level, ancient level, that's an ancient tribal memory that has come to the core. And again, it involves bulls, all the mythologies, and including a standing stone or a crow. And the raven and the crow thing is another one that's very common. And I found that when I was writing my book, The Druid Code, that the ravens had returned to Stonehenge. I found that very significant, that actual year. And the raven and the crow is always associated with the carrying of the soul to heaven, to the other world. Now, why is that? Because in the past they practiced excarnation, where they put a body out in the open, and the ravens and the crows came down and took the flesh away. And that's why when the bones were put inside urns, and you'd never find toe bones or finger bones, because the ravens could carry them away. And that was always that mystery. That's how we know for a fact that's how they practiced that. But you have the Valkyries in the Nordic world taking souls away. The Morrigan is a very powerful spirit among the megaliths of Ulster, Northern Ireland. And a friend of mine, Jack Roberts, who's like one of my heroes, he was worked with a guy called Martin Brennan, who was an American guy who came to Ireland in the 70s. And these guys discovered so many alignments and many Irish passage mounds and other megaliths. They used to sleep in them overnight. And when the sun would rise, they would notice, or stars or whatever, would light up the back of the chambers and so on. And they of anybody, anywhere in the world. Martin Brennan's book, The Stars and the Stones, is a must-read. You haven't read it. Fantastic illustrator. But he was chased out of Ireland by the government. Pissed off the academics because the Irish newspapers were saying, incredible discoveries at Lough Crew, incredible discoveries at Newgrange, and beyond the paper, Jack Roberts and Martin Brennan would be on the paper, newspapers, and they were shown, and they were reported back when we had real journalists. Eventually the academics said, who are these guys? And Brennan was actually chased. They wouldn't give him his visa, and the immigration people, that he was an Irish. The immigration deported him, and it's just terrible stuff that you see the nastiness that went on there. But they were the first to actually properly connect star lore with Ireland, with Irish megaliths, because there wasn't very little star lore in Celtic tradition. There was sun, moon, but not a lot of star stuff. And so I think it was Cairn T or Cairn L at Lough Crew. They discovered that certain stars touched the rock carvings in certain ways at the back when they were directly aligned in a certain, that you could see them through a gap in the top. And again, those guys, you'd say, okay, they were researchers, but I know, knowing Jack personally, is more than that. The fact that they were sleeping inside, Jack's English, by the way, they were sleeping inside the chambered tombs. They were rebirthing, I think, the megalithic experience. It was almost like they were embryos that were bringing it back, and doing it in a very clever way, because a lot of the early popular stuff that came out about megaliths, I'm talking about the 60s now, very hippie. It was like, the fertility cults. It was all about getting, women and stuff like that, and having babies, phalluses and stuff. It reflected the 60s free love era. And that was and there is some truth to that, but they were obsessed with always a fertility cult, always a fertility cult. But these people didn't think about their genitalia 24/7 and all this kind of stuff. They had other lives. And so I think that Martin Brennan and Jack Roberts were kind of very instrumental in moving, and there are many other people here in Britain as well, moving it away from that kind of hippie, free love version of the megaliths into something a bit more prosaic, actually, realistic. Now, this is a never-ending story. Find more about this. I couldn't carry them over because, as I said, the fascist police in the Potato Republic were practically chasing me over the border. But that's a book called The Druid Code that I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's available anywhere online. It's easy to get, and I think it's my favorite book I've written, because it was like a lifelong love I poured into that, rather than research. It was actual love. And in the book I mainly started with Christianity and the rollover period between Christianity and the megaliths. Now, when did the pagan megalithic veneration of the land, the sites, end, and the Christians come in and build their churches and so on? Well, it's like the Romans and Ireland. We know the Romans had a huge influence in Ireland just by the sheer numbers of Roman coins and stuff that have been found in Ireland. But the history is lost. No one knows what the full story is. Interestingly, Newgrange is where some of the main hoards of gold Roman coins were found, suggesting that in Roman times, the Romans made pilgrimages, the Roman pagans made pilgrimages to Newgrange, where it was believed that Angus Og, the Celtic god of fertility and of love, romance and poetry, was born there. That's why. And in 1669, I think it was, a Welsh antiquarian called Lund came to Newgrange and was convinced it was built by either the Romans or the Vikings. And he met a farmer there, and now remember, this is 4,500 plus years after Newgrange was built, and the farmer told him, "Oh no, that's Angus Og, that's the god of fertility that's buried in there." So that mythology had existed in that community among the people who lived there for for over 4,500 years. Now you think about that. And then it was later on proven that he was correct. And Lund, some barbarous event involving the winter solstice and the sun was described to me. Ha ha ha. Well, then we discovered in the 1960s that on the winter solstice, chamber at Newgrange, and that farmer that Lund made fun of 400 years previous was absolutely correct. It was he told them what it is. You see, this is like the Vedas in India. The spoken word, poetry and song. Like the gentleman yesterday did the beautiful Anglo-Saxon. I found that very moving because there, in Anglo-Saxon England, 1,000 or so years ago. And it's the same thing, that if you tell a song or a story, it's harder to corrupt. So you create a poem that has a great, like Beowulf, has a great story, great resonance to it, and if it's a rhyming scheme that can't be affected because you can't change the words, they can't screw down the piece of paper. All you need is someone to write the next draft. In fact, in Ireland, there was the first battle happened in Ireland, right where my studio is, under a round tower in County Sligo, called the Battle of the Books. Of course, it was Irish. So 5,000 died, right, over a copyright over two manuscripts, over a battle. But what does that tell you? The Christians wanted the pagan manuscript at any cost, so they could rewrite it and rewrite their new versions of it. And this is why you have all this nonsense British Israelism today that says things like the Ark of the Covenant was buried at Tara, and these British Israelites dug up Tara and destroyed that site forever in 1904. Tara has been completely destroyed by religious fanatics trying to the Ark of the Covenant. The concept of Scotia's tomb. You know how that happened? Some guys, they went down to somewhere in Kerry or Cork, wherever it is. Is that Scotia's tomb? Ah, sure. Yeah, it's Scotia's tomb. So said that. He said it must be true. And he didn't even know who Scotia was. It was just made up. And so this is, the corruption of also an ongoing thing. An ongoing thing. So once it's written down on paper, it's very easy to distort. But if it's in a song or a poem where the words never change and it's spoken in a language like Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic or anything, they find that much more, or Hindi, they find that much more difficult to deal with. So that's why the verbal thing lasts. Now, that's one thing that always gives you a clue. Look for the stories, the songs, the poems, and the art. That's route one back to the past. Okay? The other route one back to the past is healing. Any site associated with healing is generally, that's the truth, that's what it was. And holy wells are, a classic of that. Now that's, on that picture there of this rather beautiful and ornate place, this is St. Winifred's Well in Flintshire in Wales, holy well. And this, although you walk in this very Romanesque architecture that was built in, I think it was built in Tudor times, but they followed a kind of a Romanesque style. You get this incredible sense of ancient health and healing. And there's carvings of people from all over these islands who travel tremendous distances to heal these waters. And again, they always seem to have a similar story. It's whether St. Bridget's Well in Ireland and many other wells, the story is always of a pagan princess who wouldn't convert to Christianity, and she was murdered by her father or arrested or killed by someone, and she was jealous because she wouldn't renounce her faith, and her head fell down or something, and the water sprang up from where the head fell, and things like that. And you see that's St. Winifred's Well, and all the other holy wells all have similar stories. They're always connected to females. Very interesting, Mother Earth, again, we have the stone coming up, the phallic stone, the Cobra Stone emerging from the earth, and we have the feminine healing waters of Mother Earth coming up. And these are very ancient things and very powerful. And these holy wells are also route one to the past. And one of the facts that they've actually been re-paganizing Ireland in many ways. When I was a kid, people went to these holy wells and they might leave very few. They're very rarely patronised. And you'd have things like mass cards or pictures of saints or maybe a little statue of the Virgin Mary or something. Well, nowadays you go to them and people tie these ribbons all over the holly trees. And one near me where you can't even see the hawthorn tree anymore, or the blackthorn, because it's covered in these ribbons, which is a pagan thing. And it's kind of like an asking the fairies for a blessing or asking the fairies for a favour. It's a magical ritual. Now that has completely exploded back into popularity in Ireland now, where you go to the holy wells and you might see very few Christian statues and lots of pagan ones. Now another thing as well, and that has to be as not fully investigated, mainly because of propaganda and destruction of history, is when exactly did paganism end and Christianity start, and what was the rollover period? Now, there's a book called the Book of Ballymote from a place very close to where I live, in County Sligo, and it's from 1310. And in it, it has a page dedicated to the deciphering of Ogham's, what you call Ogham, it's pronounced Ogham script, and also the Furtek. And they called it the Rune of the Vikings, and they called it the Rune of the Druids. Now, this is written in a very paranoid way, as if they're saying, now this is 1310 now. This is supposedly nearly 1,800 years after the alleged existence of St. Patrick, who wasn't real anyway. And why are these monks in the 1300s still nervous about pagans and druids? Why are they still scared about it? Why are they teaching them? Why are they teaching the new monks about, you better learn how to read this Ogham script or this Furtek rune script, because these pagans are operating underground behind their scenes? You know, this is the thing. This is the when did it end? And that's, you know, they would have you believe that one day St. Patrick showed up and he went, look, here's a shamrock, go away snakes. And then the next day everyone was like going, oh, blessing themselves and looking at Rome, or, you know, following Jesus. It didn't happen like that. In fact, I believe in art, they always try to make out, if you read Catherine Nixie's The Darkening Age, the conquest of Europe was absolutely vicious following Constantine. This nonsense that it was some kind of thing that the European people were like fed up of their old pagan religions and wanted a new, more positive religion. You know, one where if you did what you were told, you weren't burned in a lake of fire for all eternity. And it was absolutely brutal. This is one of the great mysteries of history. You know what they did to the Cathars, but that had been going on for centuries. The last Swedish Crusade ended in the 1500s, 1490 something. That was the third Swedish Crusade to exterminate the pagans of Karelia and East Prussia. And that's how long paganism lasted. They were still raising armies, you know, right up into the time of the Renaissance to wipe out pagan cultures in Europe. So this story that it was peaceful is a lie. If you read Catherine Nixie's book, it would absolutely shock you. They saw Christianity the same way we today see things like, the Taliban. They were terrified of them, and Jews were terrified of them as well. And they were, they literally hammer and axe wielding nut jobs who came out of the desert. And they attacked the temple of Palmyra, the temple of Athena in Palmyra. And that's why all the stones, all the statues in the pagan world, of the Christian, the classical world have their noses chopped off. I don't want to be here. I could be here for the rest of the night talking about this, but they talk about, when I was in school, they told us all about Plato and Aristotle and Archimedes and all the others. But you know what they never told us? That they were pagans. The world that we live in today was a result of people who existed, Europeans who existed before the Christian invasion. And that's what it was. Because when Constantine saw these nut jobs, he said, that's the army we need. And he didn't even convert, because when he died, he had a monument commissioned to him, and there he's given a statue of him giving a sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter. So he didn't even convert. And the stories are the same all over the world. And in Ireland, we're told that it was a lovely, peaceful conversion. St. Patrick was a great guy. Everyone loved him. He was like, an entertainer. He came over and he made magic, which is forbidden under the Torah, but, never mind. And he did a special for us. and he got rid of the snakes, which never existed in Ireland anyway, and so on. And he took the last pagan god of Ireland, the Crom Cruach, and burned his idols down and banished the Druids and this stuff. But the people wanted it. But if you look again below the surface, the last pagan king of Ireland was a guy called Diarmaid MacCalla, and he literally wrote on his deathbed, "Do not under any circumstances make deals with the clergy of the church. Woe to you if you do. They are not to be trusted." And he was eventually murdered after he did every accommodation to try and make deals with the church to stop forced conversions of pagans. And you hear about St. Patrick's magical fire at Tara, where he dispelled the Druids and the pagan kings with a magical fire. Well, that was a military assault. That's all that was. And that was, what St. Patrick probably was a Henry Kissinger type operative who came over to Ireland with a ton of money and probably a small force of troops, and rustled up local mercenaries and made financial deals like the EU does today with the local chieftains and stuff. And suddenly, and just like what happened with the British Raj, suddenly Indians didn't. The British Raj wasn't a case of Britain invading and taking over. It was the East India Company and the Dutch companies and the British government taking them over and suddenly making deals with the local Maharajas, and suddenly everyone was a Christian, and everyone was, or if they were wanted to convert, everyone was in the British Empire. It was business, just like how the EU works. Changed, and the same thing happened. Now I'll finish up with that. The next object here. This is here in England. I was making a film called Who Stole the Allfather, and it's on the Beyond Room 313 channel, which is a wonderful channel, even though I say so myself. You should be subscribing to it. And tonight we have a premiere about, believe it or not, Sasquatch. It's going out at 3:30 a.m. and it's a film that's going to apply the Ferry Folklore thing towards the Sasquatch Bigfoot phenomena in the same way we have the Ferry Folklore with our stuff, trying to bring it back to the Indians and the natives and stuff like that. And it's beautifully made, and we have a professional score, and we've got stunning footage, so check that out if you have. Watch it tomorrow, you'll be able to see it tomorrow. But I have a film called Who Stole the Allfather, and I basically summarize that Odin, when there was no usage of the crucifix until about the Middle Ages. The symbol for Jesus was a fish, sometimes a cockerel, which is why France has a cockerel as their national symbol. And St. Augustine wanted the cockerel to be the symbol of Jesus, often a lamb. Now, if you're Christian, I'm not putting you down. Don't think anything like that. It's nothing like that. I have loads of Christian friends, and we don't have any problems with this kind of stuff. It's just that they have it's me just saying, look, you had it for 2,000 years. I want to give it back to you. Let's see how you feel about it. But it's not an antagonistic thing, much. But these are called the Sandbach crosses, and then a place called Congleton in Cheshire. And they are Anglo-Saxon high crosses. You see the Irish high crosses. These are the Anglo-Saxon version. Now, these were built by King Pende, who was the son of King Penda, who was the last pagan king of Mercia. So this is, boom, silver bullet ground zero to the crossover period between Christianity and paganism. Well, up along the side, there's a mixture of Christian and pagan motifs. And so it's a kind of like a there it is. There was a hybrid period that went between the two systems, but it's done in a poetic style called Anglo-Saxon. It's called dream poetry. It's a very specific kind of Anglo-Saxon style, and between this one and some others around the country, the UK, they show Jesus as not a guy who was sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate and to save his people, but he's shown as a heroic lord who died suspended upside down from a tree fighting his enemies. Well, who's that? It's Odin. It's Wotan, the Anglo-Saxon and the Nordic and Scandinavian pagan allfather. So you see what they did. They went into Northern Europe and took the story of Odin, took those archetypes. The Christians, unbelievably clever. You have to give it to them. You have to, just like they used Mithra for the Persian god, who was basically the god of the Roman army and the Roman working classes, and they changed Hecate into the Virgin Mary, and that's why you have Virgin Mary statues at crossroads all over, Italy and Portugal and Spain and even Ireland. Been replaced by the Virgin Mary. She was the goddess of magic on the crossroads, and right there in the things like the sandback crosses, the Book of Ballymote, the Holy Wells, what you have, the growing Cobra Stone growing in Sri Lanka and Delft Island in the Indian Ocean, is you have a lexicon, a cipher, deciphering the stories that maybe, just maybe, and like what Sue and Peter are doing, and others, that just maybe we're not as far away from that world as we think we've always been. And we're a lot closer to it. And the key to it is a combination of re-energizing the sensations around them through things like art, drumming, singing, poetry, or even just communicating with the art on them, coupled with using the local mythology as a kind of fragments of the operating software that built them in the first place. And it makes the whole field of this incredibly exciting and interesting, because suddenly you have a whole new way of looking at things. But it's also very good in your daily life, because it also reminds you of how our ancestors, especially in these times of COVID and stuff, how they've been up in the past. They would have mythologized the kind like Hancock and Ferguson, like you have here, and all the idiots who are locking us down and stuff like that and making us wear masks. They would have mythologized them as bad guys and us as the good guys. And they've taken that from us. But when you jump into the consciousness of the hero's journey through mythology, as outlined by the likes of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and apply it to the ancient sites, you realize that human beings are absolutely amazing. And we actually have the ability to survive anything. And how we do it is, we do it through our veneration of the landscape where we live. In fact, the ancient Irish pagan kings used to marry Ireland. They used to marry Ireland. That was actually the High King of Ireland. His first duty was to marry Ireland, the goddess Era, and that was the first duty before anything else. That made him say, you are responsible for the legacy that's here, and we're responsible for the legacy of the past. So that's the whole thing. Folklore and mythology tells us more about ourselves and our relationship to these sites than just about anything else, but also makes you realize that and us are the same thing. So thanks very much, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.
Fantastic show, wonderfully beautiful. I love the way you don't just look at things straight on. You take like a view from left field, think of things are fresh. It's really brilliant, and bring it into our actual daily life. It's learn to do that.
I think artistic people have a good way of doing that. Yeah, I'm not saying they're better than the regular researchers. It's just a curveball into a different direction.
Yeah, because everybody does it, don't you? You see the general idea of the way things are looked at and follow it. It's so great to have that gift to be able to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe it's this over here, and test it out. Brilliant. Do you have any questions you want to hang about?
No, well, if you have a question, I'll answer real quickly. But don't forget, will you please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Beyond Room 313? And if you want to do some reading, the Druid Code is available at all capitalist monstrosities.
Some of those films that you're making now are really professional, aren't they? Yeah, so really.
That lady there's a question.
John was before just an observation.
Use the mic, because I've got tinnitus and it's a bit sometimes hard.
It's just an observation rather than a question. I absolutely enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I love your perspective. It's just a general comment that I want to make at this point. And the fact that I struggle with the fact that the word Christian is used, in fact, to indicate church. I think what's attributed to Christianity is actually what the churches have done. I'm thinking of the Essenes and the first Christian community, very close to paganism, if we want to define things that way, and very, very closely woven and connected with the earth and with the Earth Mother worship. So I would prefer the word church to be used for that kind of oppression.
I completely agree. I don't, like I said, I don't mean to be antagonistic or hurtful to people's conviction. In Ireland, a lot of Catholic people are now calling themselves and becoming folk Catholics, where it's everything Catholic except the Pope and the Vatican. You know, so they maintain the rites, the rituals, the holy days and all that stuff, and which are all well, Catholicism is 80% pagan anyway, so you're practically already there. But so that's a big thing in Ireland. I said, like, because of the behaviour of the church, people have just said away with the intermediaries and straight to Route 1, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's a really healthy development. Anyone else?
Yeah, the cut marks of. We're familiar with cut marks, cups and rings in Europe, of course. When I went over to Hawaii, I found the closest correlate to our cut marks I've seen anywhere. And they're associated there with royal birthing sites. And the ritual for Hawaiian parents was to take a piece of the umbilical cord and put it into the cups. And when you mentioned about the Irish tradition of putting seeds in, I thought, wow, that's close, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the cup, it's obviously a little shelf, a little repository. Yeah.
And there's a Hawaiian saying, there is life in the stone.
Connected to gods or whatever, yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah, just sort of share that. Thanks.
And of course, in this part of the world, they used to tie umbilical, and all over Europe, tie umbilical cords to trees, and that's where the garlands on the Christmas tree came from. It was the tree represented the Yule tree represented the continuation of the tribe, and that's what we need today more than ever, tribe. So they would have there's your grandmother, great grandmother's umbilical cord to say, look, you didn't come from nothing. You didn't fall out of a box, and she kept the world alive so you could enjoy it. And I think these are lessons we need to carry in us today, big time.
Brilliant. Right. Well, I think thanks God. Again, Thomas, fantastic. Really appreciate that. Thanks for making the journey as well.